They tried to bury me with a $150 million merger and a termination letter. Problem was, they forgot to check what I was actually holding. 20 years of loyalty bought me 50,000 shares they called worthless. Turns out those worthless shares were worth more than their entire deal. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the moment I realized I was about to get screwed. I'm Cameron Dalton, and I've been running operations at Pinnacle Systems for 2 decades. Started when we were 4 card tables in a strip mall, built every system that kept the place running. Now we're 3 floors in a glass tower, and our new CEO, Preston Wade, thinks I'm yesterday's news. The wake-up call came when I was fixing a jammed coffee machine because our HR girl couldn't figure it out. There I was, 48 years old, on my knees, fishing coffee grounds out of a plastic tube. Preston walks by with his Bluetooth headset and says, "Can't facilities handle that?" Not to me. Just tosses it out there like he's commenting on the weather. Casual and cutting. Here's what you needed to understand about guys like Preston. MBA from some fancy school, perfectly trimmed beard, shoes that cost more than most people's mortgage payment. He showed up 6 months ago with a 5-year plan and 0 respect for anyone who built this place before he arrived. First week he called me Carl. Next week Cameron became Cam without asking. Eventually he stopped using names altogether, just pointed when something needed fixing. Which was constantly because I'd built most of our core systems back when we actually cared about making things work right. The real slap came in quarterly meetings. Remember that vendor workflow I designed in 2013? Cut processing time in half, saved us hundreds of thousands. Preston presented it like he'd invented the wheel. Polished slides, corporate buzzwords, taking credit for work I'd done when he was still figuring out which end of a spreadsheet to read. People clapped. I clapped too. Because that's what survival looked like in Preston's kingdom. Then came the Monday that changed everything. Company newsletter hits my inbox. Strategic evolution, preparing for our next chapter. Corporate speak for someone's getting axed. The article was full of innovation and synergy garbage, but one number jumped out. $150 million. Meridian Corp wanted to buy us. A deal that would make Preston very rich and very powerful. I scrolled down looking for my name. Nothing. Searched the fine print. Still nothing. Just one brutal sentence buried halfway down. Operational responsibilities previously held by Cameron Dalton will be consolidated under the incoming COO. 20 years reduced to 1 line in a newsletter. No thank you, no acknowledgement. Just erased like I'd never existed. Here's the thing that got me. I was still at my desk, still working, still showing up every day. But on paper, I was already gone. Preston had executed me in silence and buried me in a document most people would skim and delete. That's when I realized the game had already started, and I was playing defense. The termination meeting invitation came Friday at 4:58. Quick alignment chat. Anyone who's worked corporate knows that's code for, "You're about to get fired." I walked into conference room B expecting theater, and Preston delivered. He was lounging back like he owned the world, tie loosened just enough to look casual. Kelly Brooks from HR sat across from him, clutching a manila folder like it contained nuclear secrets. "Cameron," Preston said, actually getting my name right for once. "We really appreciate everything you've done. 20 years, that's incredible dedication." Kelly slid the folder across with shaking hands. Standard termination package inside. Letter, NDA, severance breakdown, health insurance paperwork. But tucked between the pages was something else. A shareholder rights waiver. I picked it up, heart rate spiking, but kept my face neutral. Preston leaned forward with that smirk I'd learned to hate. "Those 50,000 shares," he said with a laugh. "Honestly, they wouldn't buy you lunch after this merger. We're doing you a favor cashing you out at all. Just sign and walk away clean." He expected me to fold. Maybe some gratitude for the generous severance. Instead, I let silence fill the room until it became uncomfortable. My eyes scanned the document, looking for the trap I knew had to be there. There it was, buried in legal jargon thick enough to choke on. This wasn't routine paperwork. This was something they desperately wanted, dressed up to look standard. I set the pen down. This isn't normal termination procedure. My voice was steady, the same tone I'd used when vendors tried to screw us on contracts back in the day. "Legal insists," Preston shrugged. "Clean exits make clean transitions. Just a formality." I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "I'll need time to review with counsel." Kelly's smile cracked like glass. Preston's eyes went hunting for a script that wasn't there. "You're not disputing the terms, are you?" "I'm not discussing them." Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked out. No drama, no raised voices. Just exit, stage left. By the time I reached the parking garage, the shock had burned off. What replaced it was something sharper, suspicion mixed with anger. Because when a guy like Preston says something is just a formality, it's anything but. That night, I went straight to my home office and pulled out the fireproof safe I hadn't opened in months. Inside were 20 years of corporate artifacts. Stock certificates, board minutes, contract copies, all the documentation I'd saved because my old man taught me that paper trails were working men's insurance. I spread everything across my desk. There were the original certificates from 2002, 50,000 shares in faded ink. The Hoffman brothers had given them to me after I single-handedly saved payroll during a brutal quarter when half our clients were late on payments. Token of gratitude, they'd said. You've been here since day one. You built the backbone of this place. Most of the early team had laughed them off or cashed out the first chance they got. Me? I'd tucked them away and forgot about them. Just old paper in a safe with my divorce decree and my son Jake's birth certificate. But as I dug deeper, I found something that made my stomach drop. A folder marked Q2 2006 Board Amendment. I barely remembered that meeting. I was too busy training new hires and fixing systems to pay attention to legal details. The amendment spelled out minority shareholder protections. Veto authority if combined voting blocks crossed certain thresholds. Signed, notarized, never revoked. Preston's waiver wasn't random legal housekeeping. He needed me to sign away rights that could kill his merger dead. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. He hadn't underestimated me by accident. He'd tried to eliminate me before I figured out what I was holding. As I shuffled through the papers, an old Father's Day card fell out. Jake's artwork from when he was 7, the year I missed his baseball championship because of a server crash. Happy Father's Day, Dad. You're the best fixer. His crooked kid handwriting. The sacrifices weren't abstract anymore. They were right there in crayon and construction paper. Every missed game, school play, family dinner. All so I could keep this company alive while other people got rich off my work. I pulled out my calculator and started running numbers. Share dilution, expired proxies, early employees who'd sold out or walked away. The math was ugly, but the conclusion was crystal clear. My 50,000 shares weren't dust. They were enough to qualify as a blocking position. Enough to stop any merger Preston tried to push through. Here's what I realized sitting there with those papers spread like battle plans. I wasn't powerless. What Preston dismissed as worthless was the nuclear option that could blow up his entire scheme. Monday morning brought the first wave. Email at 9:03, bright and cheery like a car dealership ad. Gentle reminder to finalize your exit paperwork for smooth transition. Same waiver attached. I deleted it without reading twice. By 11, another email landed from some lawyer I'd never met. Warning about delays complicating pending corporate actions with hints about unfavorable consequences. Translation, sign the damn paper or we'll make your life hell. I didn't bother responding. Silence was becoming my strategy. Tuesday ramped up the pressure. My phone buzzed with Preston's number while I was heating leftover pizza. I thought about letting it ring, but curiosity won. I wanted to hear what desperation sounded like wrapped in MBA confidence. Cameron, he started, too bright, too cheerful. Just checking in. Thought maybe there was confusion with the documents. No confusion, I said, taking a bite of cold pizza. A pause. His voice dropped a notch. Look, transitions are tough, but dragging this out doesn't help anyone. Those shares don't mean anything anymore. Not in this market, not after the restructuring. I let silence hang until I could practically hear him sweating through the phone. Guys like Preston hate quiet. It makes them scramble to fill the void. Finally, I said 5 words, steady and cool. We'll see about that. Then I hung up. A text buzzed through seconds later. Let's be adults about this. Don't ruin a good legacy with stubbornness. I blocked the number. Wednesday brought the smear campaign. Screenshots started trickling in from former colleagues still at the company. Slack threads questioning what I actually contributed to major projects. Whispers about outdated skill sets and resistance to change, which is corporate code for we needed him gone and couldn't think of a better excuse. I stayed quiet. Every word they threw would boomerang back eventually. That afternoon, an old colleague from my early days texted, I know they're screwing you over. Don't let them. You built half that place yourself. For a moment, warmth cut through the corporate ice. All the politics and fake handshakes had made me forget what real loyalty felt like. Reminded me there were still people who remembered when I was fixing servers at 2 a.m. to keep the company alive. So I kept my mouth shut, cold, calculated, unshakable. Because silence in the right hands isn't weakness, it's power. And Preston had no clue how much leverage I was sitting on just by refusing to play his game. Thursday, I knew I needed professional backup. Not another supportive text, not corporate HR theater. I needed someone who could stare down Preston's lawyers without blinking. That's how I found myself in Victoria Stone's office above a dry cleaner. Her space smelled like old wood and sharper still, like quiet revenge. The walls were lined with thick binders, labeled like trophies from corporate battles she'd won. Victoria was maybe 55, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, with the kind of presence that made silence feel dangerous. I handed her Preston's folder. She flipped through the pages fast enough to tell me she'd fought these fights before. Termination letter, NDA, severance packet, then the waiver. Her eyes narrowed, then relaxed into something that looked like satisfaction. "They're screwed," she said simply. I blinked. That was it. No theatrics, no legal disclaimers. Just 2 words delivered with the certainty of someone who'd already seen the ending. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe again. She tapped the waiver with one finger. "This isn't routine paperwork. This is panic. They need you neutralized before that merger clears. Without your signature, their entire deal is hanging by a thread." I gripped the armrest of my chair. "So what's our play?" Victoria smiled the kind of smile that made you glad she was on your side instead of theirs. "Nothing." I must have looked confused because she leaned forward. "You don't chase them. You don't email back. You don't negotiate. You let them panic. The more they scramble, the deeper they dig their own grave." Her words hit me like tactical intelligence. For 20 years, silence had been my default. What I used to avoid conflict, keep my head down, stay out of trouble. But now, in Victoria's playbook, silence was a weapon, and it was mine to deploy. I thought about Preston pacing his glass office, HR drafting another gentle reminder, legal teams sweating over spreadsheets they hadn't touched in years, all of them waiting for me to blink, fold, disappear quietly like a good little employee. But this time my silence would be strategic, deliberate, lethal. Victoria gathered the papers back into a neat stack. "Do nothing unless I tell you. Let them light their own fuse. When it explodes, we'll be the ones left standing." I walked out of there feeling like I'd just enlisted the right general for the right war. By the following week, I didn't need to lift a finger. The cracks were spreading on their own. Somewhere in Meridian Corp's legal department, a junior associate was buried under due diligence spreadsheets. Her job was mind-numbing and thankless, cross-referencing shareholder ledgers, verifying proxies, making sure every consent lined up perfectly. 99 times out of 100, it's rubber stamp work. But this time she stumbled across something that makes junior lawyers lose sleep and senior partners lose their minds. Cameron Dalton, Class A shareholder, legacy vesting privileges, no proxy on file, no waiver signed. By 11:15, she'd flagged it to her supervisor. By 3 p.m., there was an emergency conference call with Preston, the CFO, internal counsel, and expensive outside legal talent who billed by the heartbeat. I wasn't in that room, but I can see it perfectly. Preston brushing it off with that fake laugh he used at company events. "Oh, Cameron, he's old school, already terminated. His shares are meaningless. We have his exit paperwork, just not processed yet." Then came the response that probably made his blood freeze. Meridian's senior lawyer, voice flat and clinical. "I'm looking at the documents right now. There's no signed waiver, no proxy, nothing revoking his rights." The silence must have been deafening. I picture the CFO's coffee stopping halfway to his lips, internal counsel frantically shuffling papers like maybe reality had changed on the page. Preston tried again, voice tighter. "He won't use it. He's not that type. Always kept quiet, never made waves. Just wants to collect his severance and disappear." Here's where I almost laughed out loud in my kitchen. He wasn't wrong about my history. I had been quiet, but now my silence was tactical, and it scared the hell out of him. Meridian's lawyer didn't bend. Whether he uses it or not is irrelevant. Your entire deal structure assumes unanimous legacy consent, and you don't have it. Clean, clinical, undeniable. My blocking position sitting in plain sight like a landmine Preston thought he'd diffused. And the beautiful part, I hadn't done anything. They'd tripped over their own arrogance and exposed the flaw themselves. The game was no longer mine to win. It was theirs to lose, and they were losing spectacularly. Here's what Preston didn't understand about corporate warfare. It's not about who talks loudest or has the fanciest degree. It's about who holds the high ground and knows when to use it. 20 years of building systems and solving problems had taught me something he'd never learned in business school. Patience is a weapon. While he was scrambling to plug holes in his sinking ship, I was at home helping my son Jake with his college applications. Those worthless shares were about to become his future. The pressure kept building on their end. More emails, more calls, more legal threats disguised as friendly reminders. Each one more desperate than the last. But I'd learned something from Victoria that Preston never figured out. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Let them exhaust themselves fighting shadows while you hold the real weapon they can't see coming. The clock was ticking toward their merger deadline, and every day I stayed silent was another day their $150 million deal hung by a thread. A thread I could cut anytime I wanted. Preston had called my shares worthless. He was about to learn exactly how much worthless was worth when you knew how to use it. The war wasn't over yet, but the battle lines were drawn, and I was holding all the ammunition. At exactly 9 a.m. Monday, Victoria and I walked into the largest conference room in the building, the one with the skyline view and the walnut table polished to mirror brightness. Preston was already there, tie loosened just enough to suggest false confidence. The CFO sat rigid beside him, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Across the table, 2 representatives from Meridian looked up as we entered. Their faces were unreadable, but their presence made the air thicker. Victoria didn't waste time on pleasantries. She placed a slim black folder in front of the Meridian reps and stepped back, arms folded. Inside were documents they hadn't expected to see. My original equity grants, the 2006 amendment, undeniable proof that I'd never signed away my rights. One of the buyers flipped through page by page, his expression sharpening with each turn. Finally, he looked directly at Preston. "You told us you had unanimous legacy consent." Preston cleared his throat, forced that corporate smile. "He's been terminated. Those shares are meaningless now." That's when the older Meridian representative leaned back and delivered the line that cut the room wide open. "You made him more powerful when you fired him." The silence was surgical. Preston blinked like the floor had just collapsed. The lawyer beside him shuffled papers, but no alternate reality appeared on the pages. The man continued, voice calm and absolute. "By removing his operational duties, you severed his fiduciary obligation. He no longer has to act in your company's best interest. He can act solely in his own." You could see it hit Preston like a physical blow. For months I'd been erased, dismissed, reduced to a footnote in his grand plans. Now every pair of eyes in the room landed on me, not as an afterthought, but as the person who held $150 million in the palm of his hand. For the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt inevitable. The boardroom went dead quiet. Everyone was waiting for me to speak, and for once I didn't feel the need to rush or apologize or make anyone else comfortable. I let them lean forward, let them wonder what I would demand. Then I laid out my terms. "First," I said, voice steady and clear, "a revised payout structure for legacy shareholders. The people who kept faith when this company was 4 desks and a prayer. They will not be forgotten." The CFO actually flinched, like he'd forgotten anyone outside the executive suite had ever mattered. "Second," I continued, sliding a single page across the table, "cancellation of Preston's golden parachute package. No bonuses, no consulting contracts, no soft landing funded by the people he tried to erase." Preston's face went deep red. His jaw clenched as he gripped the table edge hard enough to leave marks. "And third," I finished, "a formal board statement acknowledging my contributions and making crystal clear that my departure was not performance-based. You will not rewrite my story for your convenience." The Meridian reps glanced at each other, then at our board chair. No one rushed to object. No one dared. Finally, the senior representative nodded slowly. "These terms are reasonable and fair." Preston exploded. "You can't just cave to this. He's hijacking the entire deal!" His voice cracked, desperate, the polished mask finally slipping completely. But it was already over. The board chair leaned back, eyes steady on Preston. "It's this or we lose the merger entirely. Your choice." Just like that, the power Preston thought he owned crumbled beneath his feet. His money, his status, his carefully crafted narrative about being the visionary who modernized our backward little company, all gone. I gathered my folder, stood up, and looked at him one last time. My voice was calm, almost conversational. "You called my 50,000 shares worthless, but they're the reason you've been rendered worthless." Then I walked out, leaving the skyline view and corporate theater behind. No applause, no dramatics. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd not only protected myself, but spoken for every forgotten person who'd been erased before me. Here's what happened in the weeks that followed. Because corporate revenge isn't just about the confrontation. It's about watching the dominoes fall. Preston tried to fight the terms, of course. Threatened to walk away from the merger entirely, take his vision elsewhere. Problem was, Meridian had already done their homework. They knew Pinnacle's real value wasn't in Preston's PowerPoint presentations. It was in the systems and processes people like me had built over 2 decades. Without me to sign away my blocking rights, there was no merger on Preston's terms. And without the merger, Preston was just an expensive CEO running a company he didn't understand, hemorrhaging talent who'd watched him try to steamroll the person who'd kept the lights on for 20 years. The board gave him a choice: accept the revised terms or watch the deal collapse entirely. Preston chose his paycheck over his pride. Smart move, probably the first one he'd made since arriving. The revised payout structure meant early employees who'd stuck around got real money instead of token gestures. People who'd worked weekends and missed family dinners while Preston was still figuring out what an operations manual was. Justice has a funny way of finding its balance when you know which levers to pull. But the real satisfaction wasn't financial. It was watching Preston's carefully constructed narrative crumble in real time. Remember how he'd presented my vendor workflow system as his innovation? Turns out when you're negotiating a $150 million deal, people want to know exactly who built what. Meridian's due diligence team started asking detailed questions about system architecture, process optimization, vendor relationships. Suddenly, Preston couldn't explain how his revolutionary improvements actually worked, because he hadn't built them. I had. The truth has a way of surfacing when real money is on the line. Every system Preston had claimed credit for, every efficiency he'd bragged about in board meetings, every process improvement he'd used to justify his salary, it all traced back to people he'd tried to erase. Meridian started asking for documentation: original design specs, implementation timelines, performance metrics. Preston's team scrambled to provide answers they didn't have to questions about work they hadn't done. That's when the real panic set in. Not just about my blocking shares, but about the fundamental lie Preston's entire tenure was built on. He wasn't the visionary who'd modernized Pinnacle systems. He was the guy who'd shown up after the house was built and tried to take credit for the architecture. The board started asking their own uncomfortable questions. If Preston didn't actually understand the systems that made the company valuable, what exactly were they paying him for? If the merger was happening despite his leadership rather than because of it, what was his role in the new structure? Here's the thing about corporate politics that Preston never figured out. It's not enough to climb the ladder. You have to understand what's holding it up. When you try to kick it away the people who built the foundation, don't be surprised when the whole thing starts wobbling. 3 weeks after our boardroom showdown, Preston was transitioning to new opportunities. Corporate speak for unemployed with a severance package. Not the golden parachute he'd negotiated originally, but enough to keep him an overpriced coffee while he figured out his next move. Meridian offered me a senior consulting position to help integrate Pinnacle's operations into their larger structure. Turns out when you're buying a company for $150 million, you want to keep the people who actually know how it works. But the best part wasn't professional vindication or financial security, though both were welcome. The best part was the message it sent to everyone who'd watched Preston try to erase 20 years of other people's work. You can't steal credit forever. You can't build a career on other people's foundations without eventually getting called to account. And you definitely can't dismiss the quiet ones as worthless without checking whether they're holding the keys to your kingdom. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't making noise. It's knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone else define it for you. Preston learned that lesson too late, and it cost him everything he thought he'd earned. The merger went through on schedule, with terms that protected the people who'd actually built the company Preston had tried to claim. Justice served cold, with a side of poetic irony. My son Jake starts college next fall with a full ride funded by those worthless shares. And that fireproof safe in my home office has some new additions now, including a settlement agreement and a formal apology from the board of directors. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my new office at Meridian's headquarters, looking out at the city skyline. Senior integration consultant, they call it. Fancy title for the guy who actually knows how things work. The irony isn't lost on me that I ended up with a better position than the one Preston tried to steal from me. But this isn't just about career advancement or financial security, though both are satisfying. This is about what happens when you refuse to let other people write your story. Let me tell you what Preston's up to these days, because corporate justice has a long memory. Last I heard, he's consulting for various firms. Corporate speak for unemployed but still wearing expensive suits. Turns out when word gets around that you got outplayed by the quiet guy you tried to erase, Other companies start asking uncomfortable questions about your judgment. Here's what I learned from this whole experience, and why I'm telling you about it. 20 years ago, when the Hoffman brothers handed me those stock certificates, I thought they were being generous. Token of gratitude, they said. Something to make me feel appreciated for pulling their asses out of the fire. What I didn't realize was they were giving me power. Real, tangible, legally binding power. The kind that can stop $150 million deals dead in their tracks when wielded correctly. But here's the thing about power. It's not just about having it. It's about knowing when you have it, understanding how to use it, and most importantly, having the backbone to deploy it when someone tries to take everything you've built. Preston made a classic mistake that guys like him make all the time. He confused quiet with weak. He thought because I didn't make noise in meetings or demand credit for my work, I was someone he could push around. He saw 20 years of steady, reliable service and assumed I was desperate to keep my job at any cost. He was wrong on every count. The quiet ones aren't weak. We're observant. We're patient. We build systems and document processes and keep receipts because we understand something loud people don't. Real power comes from being indispensable, not irreplaceable. You want to know the real secret to corporate survival? It's not about playing politics or kissing up to the right people or having the fanciest degree. It's about building something that matters, documenting everything you do, and never, ever signing away your leverage without understanding what you're giving up. Those 50,000 shares weren't just pieces of paper. They were recognition that I'd been there from the beginning, that I'd helped build something from nothing. When Preston called them worthless, he was really saying my contributions were worthless. That 20 years of missed dinners and weekend work and solving problems nobody else could figure out didn't matter. He was wrong about that too. The merger went through, but on terms that protected the people who'd actually built Pinnacle Systems. Early employees got real payouts instead of token gestures. Long-term contributors were recognized for their work instead of being written out of the story. And Preston learned that you can't steal credit forever without someone eventually calling you on it. But the most satisfying part wasn't watching him fall. It was watching other people rise. Colleagues who'd been overlooked and undervalued suddenly found themselves in positions where their expertise mattered. Systems I'd built were finally credited to the person who'd actually designed them. Quiet voices were finally being heard. That's the real victory. Not just protecting yourself, but creating space for everyone else who's been told they don't matter. My son Jake is starting at MIT next fall, studying computer engineering. Full scholarship, funded by those worthless shares. When I told him the story, he just shook his head and said, "Dad, you've always been tougher than you look." He's right, but it took Preston trying to erase me to remember that. Here's what I want you to take away from all this. If you're the guy who shows up early and stays late, who fixes problems without being asked, who builds systems that keep things running smoothly, your work matters. Document it, keep records. Understand your value even when other people don't. If someone tries to erase your contributions or push you aside for someone with better connections or fancier credentials, don't just accept it. Fight smart, not loud. Know your leverage and use it strategically. And if anyone ever calls your hard-earned equity worthless, make damn sure you understand exactly what it's worth before you sign anything. Those pieces of paper might be the key to your kingdom. The corporate world is full of Preston Wades. MBA graduates with great hair and zero respect for the people who built what they're trying to claim. They'll smile and shake your hand while planning to throw you under the bus. They'll take credit for your work and then act surprised when you object. But here's what they don't understand about people like us. We're not just building companies. We're building legacies. We're creating systems that outlast any individual CEO or quarterly earnings report. We're the backbone that holds everything together when the pretty faces move on to their next opportunity. Preston thought he could discard me like outdated equipment. What he didn't realize was that he was trying to throw away the person who knew where all the bodies were buried, who understood how everything really worked, who had legal standing to stop his entire scheme. Big mistake, expensive mistake, career-ending mistake. Sometimes the best revenge isn't making noise or causing drama. Sometimes it's just knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone else define it for you. Sometimes it's holding on to what's rightfully yours and using it when the time is right. Preston called my shares worthless. They were worth $150 million in leverage and a lifetime of satisfaction. Not bad for a quiet guy who just wanted to fix the coffee machine and get back to work. The lesson here isn't complicated. Build something that matters. Document everything. Keep your receipts, know your value. And when someone tries to steal what you've earned, don't go quietly. Fight smart, fight strategically, fight to win. Because sometimes the underdog has bigger teeth than anyone realizes. And sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should worry about most. Preston learned that lesson the hard way. I hope you never have to teach it to anyone yourself, but if you do, remember this story. Remember that your contributions matter, your experience has value, and your equity is worth exactly what you're willing to fight for. 20 years of loyalty bought me 50,000 shares and the power to stop a merger in its tracks. Preston called them worthless right up until they cost him everything. That's a mistake he'll never make again. And neither will anyone else who heard this story. Sometimes David really does beat Goliath. Sometimes the quiet guy in the corner office holds all the cards. Sometimes what looks like weakness is actually strength waiting for the right moment to show itself. This was my moment. I didn't waste it. What's yours going to be?